Last week, we saw James Cook, Jared Goff, Jordan Addison, Baker Mayfield, Sam Laporta, and Jalen Waddle go off in fantasy football and help people advance to the next round of the fantasy football playoffs. Well, in today's video, as we're looking at week 16, round 2 of the playoffs, I'm going to bring you 10 names who will do the same, 10 guys who will dominate round 2 of the fantasy football playoffs and help you reach the fantasy championships. All right, so the first player that I believe is going to dominate, it's a little bit of there's some hot takes on today's video, okay? Some hot takes. Gus Edwards at the San Francisco 49ers. The 49ers are a fantastic defense. However, the Baltimore Ravens are a really, really good offense. So this is two Titans kind of clashing at it. Two potential Super Bowl contending teams going at it as well. And it's the last game of this week, so it'll be an exciting one to watch on Christmas Day. But keep in mind, guys, Keaton Mitchell is out for the year with a torn ACL. And Keaton was really the reason that Gus Edwards started to lose steam for fantasy purposes. Gus was an absolutely dominant force for fantasy before the Keaton train started really taking off. In a 5-game span, let's remember, 5-game span from week 7 to 11, before Keaton got hot, Gus Edwards was averaging 12.2 carries, almost 78 yards per game. He was averaging almost 2 touchdowns per game. He had 9 total touchdowns in that 5-game span, which is ridiculous. He was averaging just under 20 PPR points per game. And in that 5-week stretch, he was the RB2 in fantasy football. Now, with Keaton out of the picture, Gus will reacquire, if you will, that old role that he had before Keaton started to take off. And anytime this team is within the 5-yard line, Gus is going to get a chance to score a touchdown. Now, if you go back and look at those averages, Gus wasn't dominating carries. He wasn't dominating yardage. He was just the option on the goal line. So I believe that when the Ravens have those opportunities in this game, Gus Edwards is going to be their answer, considering Mark Andrews is gone, Keaton Mitchell is gone. The 49ers in 2023 actually allow the third fewest rushing yards per game at 89.4. So this is a little bit of a hot take. But again, we have a very good offense, and we're not really wanting Gus Edwards to go out there and get 100 rushing yards. We just need him to get into the end zone. They allow the 13th highest yards per rush at 4.3. And more importantly, they are a good defense, but when you adjust for schedule, the 49ers are allowing the 10th most fantasy points per game at 22.8 PPR points a game. Shout out to 4 for 4 for that information. So we are starting Gus Edwards if you need to. Now, obviously, I'm not claiming here that Gus Edwards is in the top 15 of my rankings, but if you guys have some injuries and you're concerned, you can start Gus with some confidence. All right, the second player. This might be a little hot takey again, but we got a lot of bounce backs this week. Garrett Wilson versus the Washington Commanders, and I know a lot of people will not be starting Garrett Wilson this week. To be fair, a lot of people who had him might not even be in the playoffs anymore. But after he put up that abysmal 5.9 performance, PPR point performance versus Miami. But this situation is perfect in week 16 for a bounce back. He gets to play the Washington Commanders, who in 2023, there are very few matchups that you look forward to more than this team. In 2023, they give up the most passing yards per game at 264.8. Now, we don't know if Zach Wilson's going to play or not, but the reality is this is one of the worst secondaries in the league. You're going to get Garrett, who is going to get a ridiculous amount of targets. Last week, Miami was able to put a ton of pressure on the Jets offense. Meanwhile, the Commanders sent away all their best edge rushers. They're not going to be able to get pressure. They also give up the most yards per game at 384.5. The Commanders are almost giving up 400 yards per game. That is ridiculous. They also give up the first most points per game. They're allowing over 30 points per game to opposing offenses. They're the only team in the NFL allowing more than 27 points per game. They're the only team giving up 4 touchdowns a game in points, which is ridiculous. And for fantasy purposes, this is the second best matchup for your wide receiver. So yeah, I'm putting Garrett Wilson back into my lineup. We'll see if Zach Wilson's playing or not, but regardless, I am kind of guaranteeing, I guess, a 10 target game and a good performance for Garrett Wilson. This may be his best of the year, as crazy as that sounds. All right, this brings us to my spicy hot bold take of the week. Similar to Garrett Wilson, I can imagine a lot of people not trusting this name with their fantasy hopes on the line, but I'm here to give you the confidence to put him back into your lineup. My spicy hot bold take is that Bijan Robinson bounces back versus the Indianapolis Colts and puts up over 20 PPR points in week 16. This is the perfect matchup for Bijan to bounce back. I know last week was weird. Let's address the elephant in the room. Last week, he only had 10 total opportunities, 7 carries, 3 targets. He fumbled, and then Arthur Smith thought it would be a really cool idea to teach him a lesson, to put their best offensive weapon on the bench in a game where they lost 7-9 versus the 2-win Panther team, the 1-win Panther team at that time. But Arthur Smith is starting to fight for his job at this point. You need to put your best players on the field, and this is the perfect matchup to kind of bounce back with. I mean, I remember after his game versus Minnesota in week 9, I also told you guys in week 10 versus the Cardinals to go out and put him into your lineup with confidence. He went up and put 17.6 PPR points on the board. I think he's going to bounce back in a big way versus the Colts, who give up the 7th most rushing yards per game, the 6th most points allowed per game to opposing offenses. And more importantly, when you adjust for schedule, this is the 3rd best matchup for running backs in fantasy football at 28 PPR points per game. Put Bijan into your lineups. He's going to bounce back. We have seen it already this year, and he is the best weapon on this team. Don't screw us over, Arthur. Don't do it again. All right, the 4th player that I think could dominate, I wanted to give you guys a really exciting streaming quarterback option. Now, this isn't a name that's inside my top 8, but it's a player that I think could have a huge week and is probably available on some of your waiver wires. That is Joe Flacco. He faces the Houston Texans at Houston. Good news, a lot of bad weather games, but this one is in a dome over in H-Town. Go ahead. You can take a laugh at me. Yeah, I'm telling you to start Joe Flacco, but Joe Flacco's been a unit for fantasy purposes since he started for this team back in week 13. In the last 3 weeks, he's averaging 19.5 points per game. So, get the laughs in. But what if I told you Joe Flacco's averaging more fantasy points this year than CJ Stroud? What if I told you he's averaging more fantasy points than Patrick Mahomes, than Justin Herbert, than Justin Fields, than Jared Goff, than Tua Tags? Joe Flacco's on a tear to start his 2023 season, and now he gets to play the Texans, who in 2023 give up the 8th most passing yards and allow the 4th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, averaging over 20 points allowed to the quarterback position. So Joe Flacco, I know he's limited at the time of recording this with a calf injury, but I believe he will play. He has been turnover prone, but he is just that gunslinger guy. It's almost like Jameis Winston. You guys remember Jameis Winston on the Bucs? It's like, we're going to sling the ball around. Yeah, we might throw some turnovers, but let's get it to our big playmakers like Amari Cooper. All right, the 5th player that I think is going to dominate this week, that is Evan Ingram at the Tampa Bay Bucs. Without Christian Kirk, Evan has taken a huge step up for this offense. It's only been 2 games, but here it's technically been, I believe, 3, but 2 full games without Christian Kirk. And here are how the splits are looking. In split, that's with Christian Kirk, 12 games. Out of split, that is 2 games without Christian Kirk. You can see he goes from averaging about 11.5 points per game to 19.5 points per game. You can see his receiving yardage is up. His targets are up. All of those numbers are up without Christian Kirk. Simply put, Evan Ingram has become the most reliable receiver for this team. The safety blanket, if you will. I know Trevor Lawrence is in concussion protocol, but I don't care who's starting. You can throw all over this Bucs defense. I like Jags receivers this week. And matchups are so important for the tight end position. You really want to find those good matchups. The Bucs allowing the 3rd most points to the tight end position, over 15.3 points allowed. They also give the 2nd most passing yards in the NFL and the 7th most total yards to opposing offenses. All right, the 6th player that I think is definitely worthy of a start this week, that is Jordan Addison versus the Detroit Lions. The Lions defense has been improving, but You know, they're getting some key pieces back, but they've still been relatively vulnerable in their secondary this year. The Lions in 2023 are middle of the pack when it comes to passing yards allowed, so you can throw on them. They also allow the 9th most points per game, so they're giving up top 10 points to opposing offenses. And for your fantasy wide receivers, they're giving up the 8th most fantasy points when you adjust for schedule. And this is really less about this secondary being bad, because I think they are improving. It's more about this game and how I envision it playing out. A divisional game where the Lions are fighting for the number 1 seed in the NFC. The Vikings are fighting just to get into the playoffs. So we've got 2 teams who have a lot at stake, but we also have 2 offenses that are absolutely stacked with talent. There's a high over-under in this game, so Vegas is expecting a lot of fantasy points, and I want pieces in that kind of matchup in a dome, as we know. So I'm going to go ahead and start Jordan Addison this week. All right, we said we like the Jets versus Washington. That includes Bree Hall. It's a bounce back for all Jets this week. He plays the Commanders, who give up the 11th most rushing yards per game, the most yards per game overall, the most points per game, and for fantasy purposes, this is the 2nd best matchup for your fantasy wide receiver, or running back, Remember last week on this very show, guys, we were telling you to start Kyren Williams. He was going to go off. He ended up putting up 24 fantasy points. Of course, he's been more consistent than Bree Hall, but we know how talented Bree is. The Jets are not going to be blown out of the building by the Commanders. They will be heavily in this game, and Bree Hall should play a very, very important part to the offense. All right, earlier we told you to start Joe Flacco. Well, if Joe Flacco is going to have a day, we're predicting Amari Cooper to also have a day in H-Town. The Texans allowing the 8th most passing yards per game, but specifically for wide receiver position, the 4th most fantasy points to wide receivers, almost 40 PPR points allowed per game. And Amari Cooper has been the focal point of this receiving attack. It's actually he and David Njoku both have been very, very good for fantasy purposes. Last week, Amari Cooper, 8 targets, 109 yards, and a receiving touchdown, finishing with over 20 PPR points. We're going to trust him again in our lineups this week versus H-Town. All right, with the 9th player, we get a guy who is coming back from injury that we are automatically putting straight back into our lineups. That's Isaiah Pacheco versus the Las Vegas Raiders. The last time he played this team was in week 12, and he put up a career high in fantasy points, 25.9 PPR points, including 2 rushing touchdowns. The Raiders in 2023 give up the 9th most rushing yards per game, have allowed the 10th highest yards per rush, and for fantasy purposes, they are the 4th best matchup, averaging 25 PPR points per game. Pacheco really is the centerpiece of that offense. They've been missing him, and I believe when he's back, he'll be back to that feature role. All right, the 10th player that we are in on, we said we're in on Jags receivers this week. No Christian Kirk. Calvin Ridley is someone that I'm absolutely willing to play. For all the reasons we're in on Evan Ingram, we are also in on Calvin Ridley, who, by the way, is averaging 12.5 targets per game since Kirk went down with an injury. Guys, I don't care who's playing quarterback. I really don't. The way to beat this team is by throwing on them. Their secondary is potentially the worst secondary in the NFL, giving up the 2nd most passing yards per game and the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers, over 43 points per game. I know Calvin's been up, he's been down, but this is a matchup in particular where I am going to trust him. So that's it for today, guys. Do me a massive favor. Go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe if you like fantasy football. And happy holidays. This will be one of the last videos that we post this year. If you guys don't know, we go on a 2-week break for Christmas and for New Year. And then we kind of start to ramp things up over on our Dynasty channel. So go check out our Dynasty channel. You can find it in the description. But yeah, we appreciate y'all. Thanks for the love this year, and good luck. And we'll see you soon. Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, L-A-N-D, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.
It's so easy. Even your grandma could scan that QR code right there.